David K. Johnson with us today. It is awesome to have him, and so I will bring him into the mix. Hi, how are you?
Hello. The Mark Thompson Show.
Sorry, I stepped all over the bumper. How's it going? Ooh, pretty view today outside your house.
Yeah, I was hoping I would get my my waterfall, which in January is still running, into the picture, even though there's snowfall out there.
It is snowy out there. It's chilly where you are.
Just a little. We've had hardly any snow here. 60 miles west of me in Buffalo, they got over their whole year's supply, 100 inches before the start of the new year. But we've had hardly any snow this year.
Oh, it looks pretty out there, though. For us in California, it looks like a winter wonderland out there.
Yeah, when I was a kid, you know, it was like, snow? Grandma, you grew up in snow? Tell me about snow.
My son was telling me the other day, Mom, I don't remember snow. I took him when he was like 3 to Tahoe. We haven't been back. I mean, the COVID happened. Everything else got in the way. So now I feel remiss that my 8-year-old has no idea what snow looks like or feels like. Let's get right into it, because we got a problem in this country. This whole documents thing is getting out of hand. So the FBI is investigating Trump and Biden, and now we've got Mike Pence's attorneys saying he's got these classified documents as well. Who's next? What's going on?
Well, first of all, one of the biggest scandals, Kim, in Washington going back to World War II is the excessive classification of documents.
Okay.
And my peers in investigative reporters and editors all have stories about documents they tried to get that were labeled classified. And when you got them, you looked at this and went, what? It has nothing to do with national security. It has to do with saving someone from embarrassment or hiding a government action under the Freedom of Information Act.
Yeah.
But there is a very important distinction between what's going on with Joe Biden and Mike Pence. Clearly, they were sloppy about handling these documents, and clearly the national security establishment does a lousy job of saying, hey, where's the document we gave you? But in their cases, they weren't doing what Donald Trump did, which is he lied, he denied, he had other people lie and deny under oath who may end up losing their law licenses or even going to prison over this. They were forthright about their screw-ups here. And also, so far, nothing in Mike Pence's, enormous house. And of course, here in this part of the country, shouldn't surprise you that a house that big only costs $1.9 million. There's a joke about Rochester that $1 million house in the Bay Area will give you a $50,000 building on a $950,000 lot. We're the opposite.
Yep.
The documents that have been found so far, with one exception in Biden's case, and we don't know yet in Pence's for sure, are not super high-level, top-secret documents. They aren't the identities of our undercover agents or people who are feeding us information, people who are our assets in places like the Kremlin. So, this is sloppy and bad, and we need to address it, but there are wholly different categories here of what's going on. And by the way, I don't think this is the end of this. I suspect we're going to find out some other people have them. And presidential candidates, once the parties nominate them, they get briefings. It's entirely possible, say, that Mitt Romney will turn out to have some, or a Kamala Harris will have some.
I mean, who doesn't? Who won't have some, just hanging around?
Yeah, I have classified documents in my house, but there were ones the government released or they were leaked in the government, okay.
So, I guess the question is, who fixes this? I mean, obviously we have a problem. We have no control over papers that, for whatever reason, whether it's to keep it away from the press or, just because are marked classified or top secret or what have you. And so how should we go about fixing this problem so that, I feel like, especially since Biden is kind of caught up in this, the best thing he can do here is offer a solution.
Well, drum roll, Jim Jordan is coming to the rescue.
Oh,
you can be assured that the House Republicans are going to ride to the rescue, and they're going to give the most minimal possible mention to Mike Pence and Donald Trump.
Of course.
They've made clear what they intend to do. As a practical matter, I think we need a couple of things. We really need to have a presidential commission, and nobody's going to believe one appointed by Joe Biden, so we're not going to get this right away. But a blue ribbon commission to review again the overclassification of documents. That's number one. So we stop stamping so many things secret. Secondly, we need to have, and this can be done through regulations, and Biden can do this, a set of regulations that say when you're handed a document, you also are, it's like a high grade library card. And you have to turn it back in at time X, or renew that you didn't turn it back in. And that's not a difficult thing to do. And I think is absolutely essential that we do this, because there's just clearly there's a casualness about, you know, you're the vice president of the United States in the case of both Pence and Biden, or a high-level senator who's involved in foreign affairs, as Joe Biden was for many years. And you handle these things all the time, and it becomes, you know, so it's like opening up my checkbook or a note to my kids. But the agencies should be told, you have to maintain control of these things, and we can do that through the regulatory process and what's called promulgating a new rule.
I feel like people should treat these documents like I treat my social security number. Safeguard it, know where it is, keep it to yourself, and, you know, make sure it's in a safe place.
Your wallet, your purse,
or my safe deposit box, or whatever.
In the garage.
Yeah. You know, not in my desk or my office, just hanging around where I'm just not sure.
Well, yeah, no, certainly you don't want to put it down on a bar when you go to have a drink after work.
No, but I think a presidential commission would work. I think there should be staff members also assigned to the White House, assigned to definitely on move out day, to make sure that these documents don't go anywhere else. So we'll see how this all...
Someone is going to say that in a congressional hearing, and I can almost tell you what Jim Jordan and his friends will say. So you want to spend more government money?
Oh. Well, hey, we got a problem. We got to fix it. So if it costs something, it costs something.
We have a very clear problem. And I do think we can relatively inexpensively fix it if we require a logging system for these documents.
Yeah.
That's really the sort of shocking thing, is the very super high level documents that were found in Mar-a-Lago, that it's clear now from the court record, the federal government knew Trump had these records. They sent down a senior justice official to say, give them back. And we're told we don't have these records. Those are all indications of a criminal intent. And I wrote a column when all this happened back in August, pointing out that Donald Trump doesn't know anything about world affairs. He had to be told, you know, why is there a monument, the memorial of the USS Arizona? Because he didn't know what Pearl Harbor Day was.
Outrageous.
He had to be told that Finland was a country, not a part of Russia, and all sorts of other things. And his chief of staff at the time, General Kelly, has told a lot of stories about how Trump didn't know anything. But one thing Donald knows, and one of the first things I learned when we met almost 35 years ago, he knows the value of things. And what could be more valuable to an adversary of ours than knowing the names of people in their government who are telling us stories out of school? And I think it's more than reasonable to be highly suspicious of what Trump's motive was here. And remember, these weren't boxes that were sent to Mar-a-Lago and put in some backyard storage room. They were found right in his office.
I want to move on, but before we do, I just feel like it bums me out that when you talk about intent and you talk about the difference between the cases, that because these documents were found at the Biden residence in the garage or what have you, and now at the Pence house, that it's a get out of jail free card on this particular document case for Trump.
Oh, no. One does not equal the other by any means at all. And the extensive efforts Trump made to lie and deny and pay people to lie on his behalf. Court officers, you know, have only one defense, which is I believed my client when he told me these things. And if there's anything suggesting that that was not the case, that they knew better and lied because he asked them to, they properly are disbarred and sent off to prison. We need to act here. National security documents cases are always about intent. They're not about mere possession. So I get a letter in the mail from someone anonymous and it has some security document in it. I haven't committed any crime. The issue here is, were you lying and denying and hiding? But the sloppiness is the real underlying problem, and the casualness. If these things are that secret, then we need to have a tough mechanism for going in and out of the White House and the offices of the Gang of Eight in the Senate and the House, who are entitled to see a lot of things.
Okay, let's move on to Ron DeSantis, because I'm not sure. I mean, first, you can't talk about gay stuff in elementary school. And now apparently he doesn't want our kids learning about Black history. This is something that's disturbing, because we know that the history that most kids get in school leaves out a whole chunk, right? And so we don't get to know the things that Black people have done for this country and for this world. Well,
Ron DeSantis canceled this advanced placement, that's where you get college credit in the high school course on African-American history. Now he's trying to focus on the fact that it had some queer theory built into it. But, you know, come on, Ron DeSantis is appealing to the same crowd that Trump is appealing to. He's trying to maintain a white supremacist view of history. He doesn't want people to understand what slavery was. Remember, Texas was on the verge of approving a textbook earlier in this century, until the New York Times wrote a story about one of the textbooks, and it stopped, that referred to slaves from Africa as workers coming here seeking a better life. So DeSantis here is just appealing to the racist crowd. Here's the problem he's got. He wants to be president of the United States. It's the number of people who are spitting blood racists in this country isn't big enough to elect you to the White House. And it will draw out decent people who see people based on their character, not the color of their skin. Right. It's not a smart strategy for the long run, but it does show flat out what a racist he is.
Yeah, I mean, it's outrageous. I can't, and why? I mean, why would you take a stance on something like that? I mean, you're talking about his base, but it's so random that you would just pinpoint that.
Well, I think it was an easy target for him, actually. I'm not surprised he did this. I'm surprised he did it with basically a meat axe instead of a scalpel. If he'd just gone in and said, you know, we have to review this because it's got this queer theory that I think may be inappropriate for high school students, as if nobody in high school has a sense of their sexuality, that would be one thing. But when Ron DeSantis was a member of Congress, he had a reputation as a guy who gave empty suits a good name. I mean, a real non-entity. And his leadership of the state has consistently been one that simply pushes an agenda of, white is right.
It's frustrating. Again, we're talking about Ron DeSantis and marking Black History Month, by the way, by vetoing the nonprofit College Board's proposal to give Florida students the opportunity to take an advanced placement class, and then followed by a test, I would assume, on African-American studies. So great.
If you get a high enough score on the advanced placement test, you can get college credit for your classes.
You wanted to talk about war in the Ukraine. So let's talk about that. What's the latest? And what I was just reading a story about the Putin's pivot on Ukraine could mean war in Europe for a long time to come.
Yeah. I followed this very closely, and I have a couple of advisors, one of whom was literally a military strategist and rocket scientist, and others who communicate with me almost every day about the war. And I have a number of Ukrainian friends. And Russia has largely depleted its capacity to fight. Its mercenary group, the Wagner Group, who went into the prisons and said, well, we'll let you out of prison if you go fight. Apparently, their casualty rate is running 80%. I don't care how cohesive and determined your military unit. If you're fighting for your homeland even and you're having 80% casualty rates, you're not going to have a cohesive fighting army. And Putin is clearly unwilling to accept that he is not going to win this. And now what he wants to do is speed up what was his plan all the way along. I mean, Putin has been clear in his own writings and speeches for years that he intended to put back together the old Soviet Union, and that he thinks democracy is a joke. It's one of the things he's most clear on in the record, that only people like him should be running the world and telling people what to do. And if you don't like it, well, we have a gulag, or we'll just poison you.
And maybe your underwear, poison your underwear.
I'm sorry that gasoline prices are higher, and I know there's a lot of pain for people in doing that. But that's the price of our freedom, because if you put back together the old Soviet Union, there's going to be continued warfare and trouble. And notice what the Chinese are doing. China and India were the richest countries in the world 500 years ago. China has this concept of Greater China, and they want to take back Taiwan, where the nationalists who lost the Civil War in 1949 are. They want to dominate Tibet. But they have been using awful means to control people within the zones they control, but they have not been rolling tanks across borders to take land. And there's no indication they plan to do that, with the exception of Taiwan, which I think is a lot of saber rattling, at least for now. But what Putin is doing is just indefensible. And remember how he started this. He was going to denazify the country. Ukraine, a country with a popularly elected Jewish president. I mean, there are Nazis in Ukraine, without a doubt. There are Nazis in the Bay Area.
They're everywhere. Yeah.
Yeah, they're everywhere.
Sadly.
That's no reason to go and act the way that he has. And I understand from his perspective that he can make a strong case that he feels threatened because he's surrounded by unfriendly countries. Well, why are we unfriendly to the Kremlin? I can't imagine any reason, Kim, that we should be concerned about the Kremlin, especially when it goes and proves, we want territory. We're just going to roll in and kill people. And this is consistent with hundreds of years of Russian military behavior. Killing women and children.
Yeah.
Deliberately targeting hospitals and schools while children are in session. Those aren't mistakes. That is the Russian approach to terrorizing people. And so I think we're going to see some awful battles. I hope the Ukrainians get more of the HIMARS artillery, which are incredibly precise. They get the Leopard 2 tanks from Germany via Poland. And I don't understand why General Austin, our Secretary of Defense, is against providing our best tanks to the Ukrainians. He says they're too complicated to learn how to work. Ukraine, like Russia, is full of the most remarkable people in getting things to run when they don't even have the right parts. But I firmly believe that if we don't stop Putin, your 8-year-old will be concerned about what's going on with Russian aggression when your kid is my age and the hair has turned gray.
Let's talk for a minute about those 2 Leopard 2 tanks from Germany headed that way. You have these countries that are all in that region. And on one hand, I'm glad to see Ukraine getting support. I really thought when Russia invaded Ukraine, this is going to be fast. Like, they're going to fall, they're going to crumble. Are you surprised to see Ukraine rise to the challenge? And now you're talking about, Russia's kind of capacity to fight being somewhat depleted. And are you concerned, in a whole different question, about countries nearby offering weapons of war in this fight and what that means about escalating?
Well, I wasn't surprised, but only because I've been to Ukraine. And as a result of, there's a very large Ukrainian community here in Rochester, New York. I had studied some of the background of this. Kyiv was a thriving metropolitan city 1,000 years ago when Moscow was 2 huts in the middle of the forest. If there's a mother country here, contrary to what Putin says, the mother country would be logically Ukraine, which the Soviets, by the way, used to call the Ukraine. And I've noticed a couple of times on Fox where there's great hostility to the war. You know, Tucker, I'm rooting for Putin, Carlson calling it the Ukraine.
Right.
Exactly as the old Soviet did. That the people fought back so valiantly? No, people do that in their homeland. That's the lesson America should know better than any other country. We won our Revolutionary War with not very good soldiers and the good luck of the British ultimately sending a third-rate general named Cornwallis because it was our country. This is our land. People will die for their country. We didn't learn that lesson in Vietnam. We didn't learn that lesson in the Middle East for a long time. And so not surprising how much they have fought back, that the Russian army is largely a Potemkin army. Well, the Potemkin village story isn't really true. The underlying idea is in Russian society. So, you know, ask yourself, why is it there are all these very rich Russian generals? How did they get rich? Mm-hmm. Well, that's because they arranged war games that were going to take 1 million gallons of gasoline and 1 million gallons of diesel and 1 million gallons of aviation fuel. And then they stole it all and sold it on the black market and put the money in their pocket. And they have an army organized in a fashion where there's no sergeants. You can't have field tactics, whatever your grand strategy is. You can't have field tactics that respond if you don't have sergeants who, you know, generally have a unit of 10 under them. And the supply lines, at one point, the Ukrainians using artillery forced the Russian army to have a supply line that was 75 miles long when the direct route was 25. Well, that means they could only supply 1/3 of what they were doing. And among the very first Russian soldiers killed, what was found when the Ukrainians went in, as you know, all armies do, you go in to see what happened in this battle and count bodies and collect material, you know, what's on people's computers or cell phones or half-written notes to back home to their girlfriend or their mother. And they found ready-made meals that all armies now issue that expired 20 years ago.
Oh, God.
And I mean, right off the bat, I mean, they're probably perfectly edible. You know, the expiration date may or may not be valid.
Yeah.
If you got a box of shredded wheat in your pantry that, you know, you bought 20 years ago, it's not going to kill you for sure. And it's probably not bad.
But it shows, you know.
But it tells you. Yeah. They had very little ammunition, and the ammunition they had was often out of date. Now, that means it may not fire. Your firing pin hits the bullet, and the cartridge and the bullet may not come out the other end of the gun. And of course, there's been no evidence of valiant fighting by the Russians, none at all. Whereas the Ukrainians have applied guerrilla tactics. They come out of the forest, out of nowhere, and they blow up a truck full of fuel, which makes all the Russians scurry away. This is going to get worse before it gets better. More people are going to die. More children and old people are going to be targeted, and they're going to die. And there's exactly one person in the whole world who's to blame for that, and that's Vladimir Putin. And if we want to be free, if we want to be able to travel, to have friends who live in Europe, or just to see things there, we have to decide, yes, we're going to stand with the Ukrainians because we don't want to live in a world where any dictator decides to behave this way. And to those people in the audience, I'm sure saying, oh, yeah, well, we went and invaded Iraq. Yeah, we did. It was a terrible thing. We shouldn't have done it.
Right.
That is not an excuse for giving Putin anything but a resolve that we will not stand for this in the modern world.
Let's switch to guns. Here in California, we've had back-to-back mass shootings. And while this story doesn't necessarily pertain to that, it's just frustrating when you think about the fact that these shootings keep happening and nothing is being done really to rein in gun violence in the United States. Looking at dcreport.org, there's a story here about a lawsuit targeting ghost gun regulation. Did you see this one?
Yeah.
This is a firearms maker, and 17 states say the ATF rule on ghost guns violates the Second Amendment. Well, what do you mean? If you can't regulate ghost guns, what can you regulate?
Well, the problem we have is there's a bunch of people who have this absolutist notion of the Second Amendment. Supreme Court has made it very clear in a number of decisions that no constitutional right is absolute. The Constitution, as one justice put it once, is not a suicide pact. And nonetheless, there has arisen this argument that everybody has a right to carry any weapon they want to carry. I will not be surprised if someone brings a lawsuit saying, I want to be able to buy a howitzer. Because it's an arm. I mean, I've joked on this show, it's a sick joke, I'll acknowledge that, you know, if you want to be an absolutist on the Second Amendment, we now have nuclear weapons that'll fit in a backpack. I want a personal nuclear weapon because nobody's going to mess with me when I go out with my personal nuclear weapon. This is absurd. And there is nothing in the Second Amendment that infringes your right to bear arms, that the arm you're carrying is traceable.
Right.
Your car has a VIN number, and it's stamped in various places in ways that aren't supposed to be removable, even if you burnish the top of the metal. Your cell phone has a serial number in it. And, you know, what are we going to argue next? Well, you can't use the markings on a bullet from the rifling of the barrel because that infringes your Second Amendment right. This is legal nonsense. And at the core of this is the Supreme Court effectively edited words out of the Constitution. The Second Amendment begins with the words, a well-regulated militia.
Yeah.
The militia does not mean these groups who go play warfare in the countryside and try to overthrow the government, as we saw 2 years ago. Yeah. If you belong to the National Guard, hey, you know, fine. You can have all the guns you want. But there's no reason to allow weapons of mass destruction, military weapons. And most military weapons, by law, you cannot possess. Yeah. If I suddenly produced a howitzer in the backyard behind me, you can be assured I would be in handcuffs by the end of the day if it's a working model as opposed to one that's been, you know, welded shut.
Right.
So, Kim, this is just a really serious problem with this notion of absolutism about the Constitution. And there's no evidence that the founding fathers had an absolutist view of these things. And things change. I just taught my first class of the year at Syracuse University College of Law. And we talked about the Constitution and privacy and how concepts change over time, and things that Justice Louis Brandeis wrote in a dissent when the first wiretapping case came up involving a corrupt Seattle police officer during Prohibition. And without a search warrant, his phone conversation was tapped and they used it to catch him. And he was a huge bootlegger, totally corrupt guy. And the Supreme Court initially upheld this case, but the dissent, which later became the law, was that, you know, the constitutions have to be written to be enduring. And Brandeis said, you know, the day may come when the government, without breaking into your home, can determine what papers are in a drawer. Yeah. I mean, the government can now look through the walls of your house and tell heat signature and who's there.
Who's in there.
People growing marijuana at home have been arrested over that.
Sure.
So the Supreme Court put a stop to it. Yeah. But we have to recognize the Constitution is not a suicide pact. And the idea that, you know, well, responsible gun owners, I've been a gun owner. I've owned lots of guns in my life. That's not the answer here to this. When you have 6-year-olds who go to school and shoot their teacher, and you have, in the case of the Monterey Park shooting,
right?
Monterey Park is a very heavily Chinese-American community, but it has both people from mainland China and from Taiwan. So there's a vast array of political views and philosophies. And the shooter in this case was apparently, as I read the news, another Asian individual.
Right. That's
so
true.
It wasn't a racially motivated thing. And I hope we find out if it was politically motivated or he was just nuts. But
it looks like a combination at this point with the investigation in Monterey Park, a combination of mental illness and domestic violence, both.
Yeah,
yeah.
Anyhow, we can reasonably control guns. In the Supreme Court decision, when you go back and read it, the one that caused us the trouble here actually acknowledges that the government has the capacity and the power to regulate guns. Here in New York State, we passed a law that says, guns are off grounds in places like Times Square with its huge crowds and the subways and churches. And, there's a lawsuit. I should have a right to bring my concealed weapon to church. Well, no, you shouldn't have any right to bring your weapon to my property. And if you're the pastor or the imam or the rabbi, you should be able to say, no guns here. And that's that. That's the end of the discussion.
You're talking about the Constitution. And I always was taught that it was meant to be a fluid document, that the beauty of it was that it could change with us over time. Well, clearly we have a humongous problem. We have mass shootings every time we turn around. We had the Monterey Park. We had Half Moon Bay. Last night in Oakland, couple groups of people opened fire on each other at a gas station. Bad place to open fire, by the way. But 7 people were shot. 1 died there as well. Different type of violence, but still you have a loss of life. And now we have people saying, wait a minute, even having a serial number on a gun infringes on my right. Well, then who's going to be responsible and do something? I'm outraged that, why people can't see we've got a problem and say, let's look for a solution, not keep limiting the possibilities of solutions.
Kim, I think all the public polling and deep survey work shows that the vast majority of Americans understand this. The problem is that people don't have an interest in putting time into it. This is one of the problems in a large, complex democracy. It's like the pipeline ripoff that I exposed 20 years ago, where the pipeline companies take you for, I said 3 cents a day. Congress did a study and says 2 cents a day. You're going to go join the protest against the 2 penny a day ripoff. On the other hand, the handful of people who get the money are getting a couple $2 billion a year through this little device. And, we can't look at everything as individuals, and people just don't get motivated unless something happens to their child or their loved one. As a general rule, to act on these things. And this is also a reflection of cowardice. I mean, who's one of the biggest Second Amendment voters in favor of guns in Congress? Bernie Sanders. Bernie Sanders. Why? Well, look what state he represents, and ask yourself if he'd be in office if he went to war on abuses under the Second Amendment. So long as we have the current Supreme Court, people are going to die. We need to.
I'm so sad by what you just said, and I think it's key and important. What you just said is huge.
Yeah, I mean, in my business, one of the things you learn is that's the way things are, whether you like it or not. And often, that's the way things are means people were now told about a problem and they don't care, or they don't think it's important enough for their time, and they don't make decisions to change things. But this Supreme Court is incredibly hostile to law enforcement. And remember, this is a Supreme Court that in the Dobbs decision last summer on abortion cited as authorities 2 actual 16th century witch hunters who wanted to burn witches at the stake, and did. At least one of them did. You shudder at the thought that, this is the kind of jurisprudence that we put at the highest court in our land. Police departments generally dislike the availability of assault weapons in the field. When cop killer bullets, as they were called, came out back around late 70s, police departments went nuts about this. We had the infamous hour-long shootout in Van Nuys between LAPD officers and 2 guys who were armed to the teeth and had very heavy Kevlar and other protective gear, until they finally managed to kill these guys. But it went on in the streets for an hour. We have these shootings every couple of days. They're horrendous. And what it tells me is that we really don't believe in the sanctity of human life as a society. If we do, why are we putting all our attention into people who aren't yet people and not putting the attention into people who are just walking down the street? We should only rarely hear about somebody being killed by someone with a gun at all.
Right.
And it's not a business partner, a romantic intimate, then it should be unbelievably rare.
Mm-hmm.
And yet someone took the equivalent of a modern Gatling gun, in Las Vegas and just mowed a crowd, as many people as they could kill. And we still don't know why. I don't think we ever will. But why did they have access to that kind of weaponry to do that?
I'm heartbroken and outraged. I can't. I was talking earlier about Governor Gavin Newsom here in California, who was in Monterey Park visiting the victims of the shooting there in the hospital when he gets a call about the Half Moon Bay shootings yesterday.
Right.
And so he talks to CBS News, and already his words are being misconstrued. But I will say he gets passionate and angry, right? Our governor is one that, when this happens, I can just see the fire in him. But he says to CBS Evening News, the Second Amendment is becoming a suicide pact.
Yeah, that's correct. It is.
He said he has no ideological opposition against people who responsibly own guns, get background checks, train on how to use those guns. But he says he wants to figure out how exactly the shooter in Monterey Park got access to this modified pistol, which is illegal in the state. This gun yesterday in Half Moon Bay, apparently that was registered, legally owned and whatnot. But he said, there are things that fall through the cracks. It doesn't mean that you give up. But when you said, as long as we have the Supreme Court we have, things aren't going to change, it almost feels like, well, then what's the point? Because they're going to enact legislation here in California that would restrict guns. That's going straight to the Supreme Court, and it's just going to get kicked right out. And so what's the point of doing anything?
I wouldn't quite jump to that conclusion. I think that the Supreme Court may not be quite as irresponsible as your comment sort of suggests. I mean, I think they'll be there, but they're not going to fundamentally revisit this issue,
right?
For a long time. Change in a democracy takes time. All right. It's often said that the suffrage movement took from the 1848 Seneca Falls Conference, about an hour's drive from my home, to the passage of the 19th Amendment. In fact, it took longer than that. The Seneca Falls Conference didn't come out of nowhere. So it took 100 years for women who in some places had the right to vote in British colonial America to get the right to vote under our Constitution. We got child labor laws despite the Jerry Falwells and Pat Robertsons of the day 100 and some years ago going, it is God's plan that these children work in the factories, and those who propose these laws are the agents of the devil. We still got those. And so we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that over time, and that time can mean decades, we can build a more perfect union. We can get changes. At some point, we will look back in American history and there'll be a count of here's how many people died because of the Supreme Court decision and Antonin Scalia's just horrible jurisprudence on this issue. But we will at some point turn a corner. I wrote a piece that my wife persuaded me not to publish years ago. It is one of only twice that she said, don't do this. And it was after Sandy Hook.
Yeah.
And it said, if somebody walks in and slaughters an entire school, not just one classroom, we're not going to change on gun control.
You're not wrong.
And well, my wife said, and I thought at the time she had a point, if somebody does that in a school tomorrow and, they have your column in their pocket, boy, are you going to be looking awful. I actually wish I'd gone ahead and done it. Because I actually think that's true today. If somebody walks into a school today and kills 1,000 children in a school and all their teachers and the custodians, we're not going to act. And it isn't, it's that unless those are your kids, people don't think it'll happen to them. Well, guess what? Yeah, it can happen to them. It's not something that people feel investing their time into unless it happens to them or someone they know. And the people who organize demonstrations will tell you that. They'll say there's no point in trying to organize a demonstration about X because here's the reasons folks want. It's a pretty well studied phenomena about what excites people and gets them to move and what doesn't.
Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, it is. I mean, these are just horrible realities of modern American life. Nowhere else in the world is this happening. After the one mass shooting in New Zealand, which I just visited twice this last fall,
guns gone.
Guns gone, and unity about this right away. And one of the striking things when you go to both New Zealand and Australia is many public events began with a recognition that you are living on the land of the indigenous peoples in Australia, or people, because there was only one in New Zealand, and expressions of respect. And we're doing that here in Rochester, New York. I think it might be effective over a long period of time to do that all over the country, to recognize in California that, you know, this was the land of a whole incredibly complex group of indigenous peoples. I have a map of all the languages spoken by the different indigenous peoples in the 1700s. And, you know, just in Santa Cruz County, where I grew up, there's like 10 different languages that were spoken back then. We need to develop a respect for the sanctity of human life, and we need to develop a sense that our Constitution is not a suicide pact. It is our government. We own it. We should act like owners, not like renters or, God forbid, squatters. And if necessary, then let's amend the Second Amendment, big as that fight would be, because it'll at least bring to the fore these issues.
I once took a political science class, and in discussing the role of government, the instructor said, well, one of the whole points of having a government is that people need to be protected, right? So that's why government kind of leadership came about in the first place. It's why you had kings, right? It's why you had someone to protect the people, someone to make sure that that particular region was safe. So if our country isn't safe, if we're not safe from ourselves and we're hurting each other, as we see over and over again, then wouldn't that be a failure of government, that it's not stepping in to protect its people, even from themselves?
Well, yes, except for one thing. We are a representative democracy, and it means it's a failure of us. You know, we put in office the people who aren't acting to change these laws. This is going to be a big issue when my tax book comes out, because we don't have to have this ridiculous tax system we have, you know, with all these forms and this dollar is that way and this rule applies to this transaction and not that one. None of that is necessary. But there are a lot of people who get rich off those, and they're going to work very hard to keep them in place. Well, in the case of weapons, the NRA used to be an organization of people who were hunters and sport shooters. The number of people who go hunting in this country is, I believe, down in absolute terms, and as a share of the population, it's way down from 50 or 60 years ago. Say pick 1950 as your demarcation point. And so there's a minority of people who own guns, but in that minority, there are many people who own armories, just incredible numbers of weapons. And that's certainly, no one anticipated that in writing our Constitution. And by the way, let's not miss the racist aspect of this. One of the key reasons for the Second Amendment was to make sure that slaves were intimidated, and that there were, policing in America in good part started out from slave patrols. It's not true in Europe, but it is here. And this was intended to mollify that population, terrify that population, and make sure that people who were enslaved did not rise up.
Yep.
And to, you know, the first day she was at a Supreme Court hearing, Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson, Brown Jackson,
right?
She right off, when there was some mention of, you know, the Constitution is race neutral, she said, no, it's not. I mean, these are my words, not hers, but she said, no, it's not. It's an incredibly race conscious document. And is it ever? And, you know, we don't teach an honest history about this. It goes back toward the discussion we had about Ron DeSantis and African history. In California, we don't teach an honest history of what went on with Father Junipero Serra. The first time I got sent to the principal's office was in 6th grade, where we were learning in Santa Cruz about the Santa Cruz mission. And I said, yes, but the Indians who wouldn't submit to the church and confess to Jesus Christ, they were slaughtered, they were tortured, they'd be tied to a post and the skin peeled back and salt put on their wounds. And I got sent to the principal's office, and the principal didn't believe me. Fortunately, my parents had a book about this and brought it to the school. But nonetheless, you know, well, this was upsetting to the little children. We shouldn't discuss things like this.
Oh, sorry, the truth hurts.
Yeah, and this is not like you go to England. People know perfectly well the real reason that the King of England had 2 of his wives' heads cut off.
Right.
They don't, you know, say, oh, well, you know, there was a traitorous act, you know, nonsense. We can't have change without an honest understanding of what we're doing in our society, an honest history of it. And people like Ron DeSantis are determined to make sure that that history is not well known, so that they can perpetuate their policies of white supremacy.
I kept you way too long, and I could talk to you all day long, honestly. And it's actually been really healing for me, just because I've been so upset about all these shootings. So thank you for that. I do want to tell you something about mission lessons in school. So I have kids in school, and the year before my daughter, who's now 13, went into 4th grade, everything changed. It used to be that kids had to pick a mission and do a project on that mission. They had to either go to the mission, do research on the mission, and then build a replica of said mission. And so a lot of people have these little missions in their house that their kids have built. Well, the year my daughter went to 4th grade, it changed. Now you don't build a mission. You build a replica of a Native American village. And so that's new, right?
I can make an argument for both of those. I mean, we should learn about how the missions were spread, but we should also tell an honest history about the subjugation of the peoples from the Gabrielinos on north.
Right.
So anyway, well, your audience needs to hear some other voices. So,
so thank you for being here, David Cay Johnston, at David KJ. How can people find your writing?
Well, the DC Report, I publish a lot of it. Everything I write and a lot of other people write, I reference at my Twitter account, David CAY capital J. That's probably the best way to do it. And I won't have another book out for a year. Books take a long time. But
still working on that?
Yeah.
Thank you for taking the time with us from your wintry wonderland.
Take care, Kim.
Bye. Thanks for being here. David Cay Johnston.
Hi, it's Mark, and I thought that was great. Hit the notification bell. You'll know whenever there's a new video being dropped, and please subscribe to our channel to help us save the universe.